We're certainly in a new world, but are we moving towards what Aldous Huxley wrote in 1931, a brave new world, a dystopian society? Joining me is Dr. Jayajit Bhattacharya. He is the director of C-DEP, that's the Center of Digital Economy Policy Research, and Samiran Gupta is the head of India ICANN, which basically dedicates itself to keeping the internet secure, stable, and interoperable. Dr. Bhattacharya, are we seeing ourselves at a dramatic inflection point in terms of technology vis-a-vis what's happening with the pandemic?
No, absolutely, Amitabh. What should have happened in the next 5 to 10 years has got shrunk into a 3-4 week development. And we have fast forwarded in our adoption of digital and our adoption of technology through and through. In fact, in one of my articles, what I was putting in is that pretty soon we'll have even manual workers and blue-collar workers using very heavy technology. So instead of cleaning up the drain and getting them in the morning and getting into the drains to clean them up, they'll essentially use bots activated from their home, and it'll essentially almost become work from home for even the blue-collar workers. So it's indeed going to be a very, very different world as the pandemic lifts.
Samiran, if I can come to you in terms of the internet. Now, we've seen such a upsurge in volume and traffic on the internet. Is it a silly question, though there are no silly questions, only silly answers? Why does the internet not collapse, say?
Thank you, Amitav. It's actually a very good question. You see, the internet is resourced in a manner, the global worldwide internet is resourced in a manner that there is a fair amount of capacity built in. Now, there are studies which are ongoing, particularly in Europe and even a little bit in Africa and maybe even some parts of Asia, to see how the usage has changed or has it had an impact. For most part, although the usage has shifted, let us say, from offices to homes, and those networks may not have been necessarily designed for this kind of traffic, but for most part, there has not been any major challenges. Some countries, wherever they might be, may have some challenges in terms of how it is provisioned in their country, but the resources available for everyone to use.
Dr. Bhattacharya, when you talk about the pandemic and technology, now there are a lot of worries and concerns, but there are the flip side of it as well. When you're talking about the health aspect of it, surveillance, tracking, tracing, that technology is being used in various countries around the world. What are your thoughts on that?
So I think what has basically happened is the surveillance coming out in the open. If you're saying that surveillance wasn't there earlier and it's a new phenomenon, clearly all of us understand what the reality was. All that has happened is that we now have got legal surveillance and widespread legal surveillance acceptable in a democratic setup. Because we used to have legal surveillance even in other countries which were not democratic in the setup. It is now acceptable. I think what the new normal has to figure out is under what circumstances in future will it continue to be acceptable. What are the legal provisions under which it is acceptable? Because right now it is not really coming under any clear legal provision. Some of the sections of IT Act 2000 that are supposed to allow this kind of a legal surveillance does not really uphold that this kind of legal surveillance can be done. And hence, I think the regulatory issues needs to be sorted out as we move forward. But the biggest change essentially is that there is now legal surveillance in whatever manner. I'll not go into the actual regulations around it. And that's become acceptable in the democratic world.
Samiran Gupta, when you look at the internet, and ICANN is one of the organizations that is looking at bridging, at narrowing the digital divide. Now, Dr. Bhattacharya was talking about maybe in the future you'll have even blue-collar workers working from home using bots. But are there any examples that you can give us in the current situation where the divide has been bridged or at least narrowed in terms of language, in terms of culture?
Absolutely. And that's an excellent question, Amitabh. So what we've seen is typically the internet is used in the ASCII or English language. or ASCII font or English language. And if you now look at a lot of European languages, which apart from English, they all use the same characters. So a lot of the internet in its early days grew in those scripts. Over the years, the internet has spread, and even in India, for example, you have the .bharat top-level domain now, which is not. Maybe it can be used more and better, but the fact is, the technology is now available for multilingual internet use. I'm not going to get into the details there, but let me give you an example of what we saw last week in Singapore. So the second round of pandemic to hit Singapore actually came in the form of a lot of non-native people, people who work there, and they're from different countries, and many of them don't speak English. So when they were showing up at the hospital, there was a challenge in terms of the doctors trying to understand their travel history or their health history, before they started doing any, treatment. And one of the resident doctors there worked with a couple of people and set up almost overnight, literally over a few hours, a websites that the doctors could use, and even some patients, if they knew English, to translate. It was a very simple application, just translating, there could be 10 standard questions, and the answers would get translated. And that went a long way in supporting. Now, the thought that came to my mind is, why did we have to wait for a pandemic for such a service to be available? Such a thing should be easily available across the world for people who do not speak English. And internet is the medium simply to take it across. So, yeah.
Dr. Bhattacharya, when you talk about technology, and we've seen China's dominance over the years, even before the pandemic, where are we currently at this inflection point in terms of technology and the domination that China has? And the only other competitor, if I can use that word, is the US.
So I think the US was the original dominant technology player. And around 2004, China woke up to the issue of US dominance in technology. In fact, over a small standard called WAPI, Madame Wu, who was the vice premier of China, had rounds and rounds of discussion with Dick Cheney, who was the then vice president of US, on a small standard called WAPI. Now, why would the two very, very senior representatives of the country have so many rounds of discussion on a small technology standard called WAPI, which was essentially a wireless protocol, which would replace Wi-Fi, as we know about it, which is the IEEE standard. At the same time, if you keep in mind, we had Steve Talbot and Jaswant Singh having 16 rounds of discussion on the nuclear deal. So you can imagine how much more important that little WAPI standard was compared to the nuclear deal. And both were not as senior as Dick Cheney and Madame Wu were. And it was from that point onwards that China had clearly taken up a stance that they would like to have dominance in technology. And in the next decade and a half, they have reached a level where they are clearly very close to being a dominant technology player, if not already a dominant technology player, especially in commodity technology, such as phones and video conferencing and social media and so on and so forth, your TikToks and so on. China is clearly dominating in these commodity technologies. So therefore, as we see the pandemic hitting, we see a lot of the commodity technologies being adopted, and therefore China's leadership in this area is getting a greater cementing, if we can phrase it in that fashion. So clearly, from a commodity technology perspective, China has gained immensely in the post-pandemic situation, knowingly or unknowingly. And it's a bit of a parody because the virus also originated from China, and the benefits also seems to be going back to China.
In terms of benefits, I mean, Gupta, you were talking about that specific example you gave from Singapore. Now, there are even apart from society itself, in digital technology, the haves and the have-nots. Does this pandemic actually accelerate, like you were pointing out in Singapore, the narrowing of that gap, or does it actually widen it?
So, I think I must say, Amitav, you've kept all the tricky questions for me, but I'll go back to what Jayajit said, and he made a very good point, right? Starting out when he said that what would have happened over the coming 10 years in terms of technology developments. We are actually seeing that happening in the weeks now, and it's going to continue. So the digital divide, and I think you're referring to the concept of digital divide, happens in different ways. It could happen because purely access is not available, or it could happen because the access is not available at a certain speed, or it can happen because devices aren't available, or it could also happen if your language is not being used, the language of your choice. So, and there could be various other permutations and combinations of all of these. I think it is for society and government to everywhere to figure out what is the bare minimum standard of connectivity that we would like for our people, and it could differ from geography to geography, because if you look at a country like Australia, for the longest time they use radio technology to connect over the vast central locations of plains of Australia, where it's very sparsely populated. Okay, and that technology works. So it doesn't mean that you really always need to have cutting edge technology, but you need to have technology that is effective to make sure that you can keep minimizing the divide. So I would going back to the reference that we are seeing this all kinds of new technologies being tried out, which would have happened 10 years over a decadal period. I think the challenge would be, once some of these get established and they become standards, or standards are defined, we need to see how they are implemented and used, and hopefully we don't leave anyone behind in that process. So to answer your question in one word, it's a challenge to make sure nobody's left behind.
It is a challenge, Dr. Bhattacharya. If you have any thoughts on that, and also the challenge, like you were talking about China's dominance in technology, whether it was intended or not, accelerated through the pandemic. Where does India stand in all of that?
So I think India's response cannot be overnight. It has to be a generational response. For India to get back into the game, you would need a decade of investment in a very focused manner. And it's investments into some of the things that Samiran mentioned, which is investments in developing standards, investments in developing technologies in the ecosystem. There's a massive lacking of ecosystem, even though we are a large provider of technology, but these are more of skills. Technology as a service is what we're providing, not technology as a product or technology as a online service. We are not providing that. So India clearly has a long way to go. It's not a good hand that the government has in terms of playing out what their technology policy should be. In terms of the impact that it will have on the society, and specifically India, is that one, India has a large amount of number of people who are not technologically enabled. And by enabled, I mean either they do not understand technology at all, or they do not have the equipment or the bandwidth, and so on and so forth. Now, fortuitously for the rest of the world, the pandemic kind of came at the right time from a technology perspective, because the bandwidths have been rolled out. Broadbands are now available in most cities. And even in the developing countries, broadband is now available. However, that's not true for the laborers. And for people like you and me, we can continue to stay productive by using work from home, which is a new terminology that is crept in. But that's not really true for the blue-collar workers. They've got absolutely no option of staying productive. And moving forward, their children who do not have got access to online education will also miss out on education, will miss out on a year, and that will have a longer term impact, which I don't think we're focusing on right now, and rightly so, because we can't focus on everything right now.
Yep.
But just answering your question, that the digital divide that we were talking about earlier is going to get exponentially impactful now, and that divide will grow faster and faster in a very, very accelerated manner.
Samir and Gupta, the figures that we often talk about before the pandemic vis-a-vis India was that in the last decade, say 500 million people have, Indians that is, have gone online. Almost everybody has a cell phone. But like Dr. Bhattacharya is pointing out, there is a huge gap between, and you also mentioned, whether it's the equipment, whether it's the technology, whether it's the speed, that is making two different parts of society vis-a-vis technology.
Yes, indeed. One of the other gaps that exist is very simply content. You know, even if you give somebody a cell phone, what will he or she do with it? You know, given that possibly that person's background has not allowed that person to be very well educated and to be able to use what's out there. So I agree with what Jayjeet said in terms of a decadal investment is required to build many of these things, whether it's technology standards, whether it's, so you have the internet, but do you have content in the 22 languages, which are our official languages? And if so, is that content searchable? And how much depth do you have in that content? So there are so many of these challenges, but these are not unsurmountable challenges. They can be, sort of overcome, but it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take a fair bit of time and a lot of dedication from people who work on these issues. And the investment is less on technology; it's more on time and the right people spending time getting things right.
Dr. Bhattacharya, both of you are talking about this at least a decade or a generational focus that will be needed to change. Now, something that seemingly happened in a flash, of course, it would have taken more than that, is the 5.7 billion deal that WhatsApp, Messenger, Facebook has had with Geo. What really does that mean currently in the pandemic and in future in terms of both what India is going to gain and what WhatsApp or Facebook gains?
I think the deal needs to be looked at not from the lens of the pandemic, but in the larger lens of what is it that Reliance is trying to achieve, and what is it that Facebook is trying to achieve. And I think the big question mark is that in any large corporation, it is actually preferred to have a large amount of debt if that debt can be serviced, because that has got the highest gearing from a financial perspective. And so the shareholder should actually ask for more debt in the company. It's quite perplexing that the chairman of Reliance had gone ahead and said that he will retire all debt by 2021, and the shareholders actually cheered that statement. It does not make any sense from a shareholder perspective that if the company is profitable and if the company is providing a large amount of return, then why are they moving away from debt? Now, to remove that debt, apparently, as per the chairman, one of the reasons for the deal was to reduce that debt that Reliance has, and therefore the 5 whatever billion that Facebook has invested will go towards reducing that debt. So from that perspective, one understands why Reliance is doing what they're doing, and still doesn't understand why they're removing debt unless they're not very profitable at this stage. And having said that, the bigger question mark is what does Facebook get out of not a significant stake in Geo, because they've got less than 10% stake. They've got 9.99%. So it's not a significant stake that they have. So what is it that Facebook is trying to achieve? And what is worrisome is that if the answer is not clear, then there is something that they do not want to put in public, and that becomes worrisome. But as I said, it possibly needs to be looked at not from a pandemic's lens, but
Yeah.
independent of itself.
It was happening anyway. Samir Gupta, now, say in this deal, we're looking at, of course, whether it's payments that can be used through WhatsApp for Reliance, etc. But it's not just the big companies that could gain. potentially at least, how do say the Kirana stores, could they be linked to something like a network that Reliance has and payment mechanisms to allow the technology to broaden both a consumer base and the communication between small businesses and consumers and payments?
So, Amitav, even before this deal, there have been attempts to do this in some manner. I'm not going to say whether they are successful
Yeah.
or not, but the point is, bringing literally, if you were to say the Kirana store is the last mile and the last stop on the last mile of let's say a retail chain, then that automation or that aggregation in terms of technology has attempts have been made, and I've still there's a store in Delhi that I go to, and I see he has a desktop which obviously is tapping into a larger database where he's doing stuff. So my point is we are using technology at varying levels of effectiveness. It's almost like when you get on a highway in India, you'll find a car speeding at 90 kilometers per hour, and then you'll also find a guy on a scooter or a motorcycle on the side, also on the same road, and hopefully not a cyclist or anything else. But the point is, we need to see how to make this effective, and in my view, and this is my personal view over here, a lot depends on how we use language technology. Okay, a lot of integration in terms of having something pop up on your screen is one part, but for someone to use that effectively, use it comfortably in their own language, and as Jayajit earlier mentioned, maybe people who've not been savvy about technology in the past, but they are now being forced to deal with it. How do you make that transition comfortable and effective? So a lot will depend on how language technology moves in India, in connecting a lot of people to technology.
Dr. Jajit Bhattacharya, you gave both the perspective of how the digital divide can exponentially increase with uh, technology moving or accelerating so fast. But you also started off this conversation by saying, who knows, possibly there'll be blue collar workers who are cleaning drains who will be using bots as well. In terms of this working from home, which, yes, is only available to people who are privileged like us, there would be a lot of changes that will occur post-COVID, right? I mean, in terms of people not necessarily having to have a headquarter or an office to go through, and the effects, whether it's transportation versus communication, is it a binary? Can it be balanced? Pollution? There's so many aspects that are going to change tremendously.
No, absolutely. And, when I said that there will be a change that will happen, it's not necessarily that a change will happen overnight. And it's not necessarily that the change will be of an Indian technology. But what's for sure is the change is going to happen. We will have more automation in every single thing that we do. When Somiran mentioned that languages has to be focused on, there's not just written language. There will be a large focus on spoken language.
Spoken language.
In fact, a large portion of our country is actually illiterate. And even if they are literate from a school certificate perspective, functionally they are illiterate. And therefore, the movement towards using speech-based contracts, of upholding speech-based agreements, those are movements that will happen which are techno-regulatory in nature, which needs to be brought in as quickly as possible, because we are one of the few large countries in the world with such a large population of illiterates. And that needs to be brought in. As I mentioned about technologies, there will be all kinds of non-computer, non-smartphone internet technologies, which are driven by IoT, which are driven by 3D printers, by artificial intelligence. I should be able to speak and get things done. The point is, again, will it be an Indian technology in the next 5 years that we develop, or will it again be imports that we keep indulging in? Technology is not something that comes out of a book or of a patent. It's out of an ecosystem. It's out of investments into people that technology comes up with. And are we geared towards making those investments? Do we know what is needed from an Indian perspective, or are we still looking at what the West needs and therefore try and use it in our perspective in some manner or form, which is always suboptimal? Have we built technologies for India's requirement? In fact, do we have a list of India's requirement to begin with from a technological perspective? Do we have any system which supports, let's say, the Santali language? Do we have we even identified what should be the proper script for Santali? And so on and so forth. So there are a zillion socio-technical issues that needs to be resolved. There are a zillion regulatory technical issues that needs to be resolved before we start getting benefits of the change that will happen. Now, the opportunities are massive because we do need to support everybody under the Antodaya thought process. We can't be leaving behind anyone. Therefore, how do we provide education to those who do not currently have the technological infrastructure to get that education? Can we have some kind of a community-based technology to be put into place? So these are questions that first needs to be asked. I don't think we're asking those questions. We are still in a middle class mindset where we have roughly the good bandwidth and roughly the technological infrastructure. And subsequently, we'll be looking at what China does and what US does and try and implant those technologies into India. That is something that we need to change and as quickly as possible and move towards first asking the right questions.
Right question. Samir Gupta, if I can ask you to gaze into your crystal ball, so as to speak, and what is it going to be like technology-wise post-COVID?
Oh my God. Okay, let me look for my crystal ball first. But jokes apart, if I may, Amitabh, I
Yeah.
wanted to talk a little bit about the language bit. Actually, exactly what Jayji has picked up on is
Yeah.
something that we've actually worked with the local community in India and the Southeast Asian region. So to enable Indic scripts to come online. Okay, and let me just finish this thought, and I'll go back to the question you asked.
Sure.
What we did was at ICANN, we don't consider ourselves to understand necessarily each and every language of the world, but we rely on local experts. So we had something called the Neo Brahmi Generation Panel, which was very unique, where 9 Indic languages and therefore scripts were actually kind of how to use those languages and where are the variants. When you write something in, let's say, Hindi, can there be a confusability in, let's say, Gujarati? Okay, or when you write something in Bangla, can there be confusability with, let's say, Assamese? Okay, so on and so forth. So I won't get into the details, but that work has almost all of it has come to an end. What I wanted to convey to you that these languages are all now, or these scripts, to be more precise, except Bangla, which we are just finishing up because the Bangladeshi community is also involved in that. But these scripts are now getting integrated into the root zone. So in other words, in the future, these scripts can be used as whether it's voice, whether it's written, but the back-end processing for voices, you still need some, a base of scripts. So all of this can be used. Now, to answer your question on crystal ball gazing and where technology will take us, I think we are witnessing a once in a century kind of a situation. It's going to have a deep impact on how people look at life and how people look at work. And when I say people, I'm talking about everyone. I'm talking about the migrant labor who's probably pining to go home to be with his or her family, okay, and unable to do so. Will they come back? Or would they look for jobs there? How will technology, therefore, work even in the smaller cities? or smaller towns. So yes, things are going to change. And I'll go back to what Jayjit said. We don't really know what's going to happen, but things are going to change, and there's going to be a lot of opportunities for technology to be integrated into these changes in an effective manner, hopefully. So I don't know if I've really answered your question,
Right.
but yeah.
I know we started off. I started off by looking at the Brave New World, Aldous Huxley, but then towards the late 50s, he wrote Brave New World Revisited, which is a
Yeah.
look back, and then he
True.
came up with Ireland in 1962, which was a utopian society. Like you're saying, there's so many changes that are happening, and it'll probably be somewhere in between, not either extreme, though those extremes will also be present.
Correct.
Dr. Jayjit Bhattacharya and Samiran Gupta, thanks so much for sharing your thoughts with us here.
Thank you.
My
Thank
pleasure.
you.
Thank you.